It is Friday, February 13th, 2026. No school today, so no school watch. So I wrote a really long script, and this one probably will go over 10 minutes. But there's a lot to talk about, and I feel like I'm just scratching the surface for kind of the events of yesterday, at least through my lens. I think the biggest headline on a national scale, or that most people saw, was Homan's Mission Accomplished press conference announcing the end of Operation Metro Surge here in Minneapolis, or Minnesota, yesterday. Generally speaking, the response on the ground or from other Minnesotans was, and I quote, "We'll believe it when we see it." In fact, that was an exact quote from both Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey on The Daily Show last night and the sex shop owner I mentioned on the Dildos and Guns video. It's the one time I've ever seen them both say the same thing, because there's definitely animosity between the two communities that they represent. But judging by ICE activity alone yesterday, yeah, we're not seeing it. We're still seeing abductions and reports and all sorts of things happen out there. We're still seeing brand new vehicles getting trucked in. We're still seeing Fort Snelling being reactivated once again to serve in its capacity as an ICE headquarters. So yeah, we'll believe it when we see it. And I'll let you know if we do, because, I'll be paying close attention. I was really focused yesterday on C-SPAN 3. There were two Senate committee hearings that I was tuned into with the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. That is a committee led by Republican Rand Paul, who I'm not a big fan of, but I do think that he has some convictions or values that were very important for the nature of that hearing, especially regarding constitutional overreach. I'm going to talk a bit more about the first panel, which had 4 Minnesotans, 2 Republicans, including Tom Emmer and Harry Niska, and 2 Democrats, including Keith Ellison and Paul Schnell. So let's talk about the Republicans. Tom Emmer. Tom Emmer is a gigantic piece of shit. He was born in Indiana, decided to take his racist Trumpy ass into outstate Minnesota to rally more idiots for the fascist cause. He is well known for denying the realities of the ICE occupation here in Minnesota and is a staunch advocate for the crypto industry. Cryptocurrency, notably, has been a big focus for the Trump administration because it has proven to be an extremely effective and reliable tool in fleecing lots of idiots of their money very quickly with no legal repercussions, since they now own the legal system. Also of note, crypto's not doing so hot at the moment. Bitcoin, which is still the biggest cryptocurrency, prices are below half of their all-time high, having lost about 30% of its value over the past month. Anyway, Harry Niska is a Republican state House rep from the more conservative, farther north metro area cities of Andover and Ramsey. Looking at the ICE activity map for yesterday, for example, I can speculate a few reasons why his testimony fell right in line with the party, and he generally just denied any wrongdoing on the part of the administration. However, the other 2 people on the stand did speak truth to power, and I think they did so to the American people admirably. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and Minnesota Department of Corrections Commissioner Paul Schnell really held it down. So I think Keith Ellison has done a stand-up job in his role during the surge here over the past few months. He has showed up both on the ground and in media regularly, and most importantly to me, has spent that time and his platform telling the truth and really focusing on things that matter, that people need to hear. In stark contrast to the completely compromised U.S. Attorney General, who we got to see on the stand the other day, talking about how the Dow over 5,000 made pedophilia okay, Keith Ellison is a guy who clearly has a commitment to genuine and impartial law and order. And Paul Schnell, the Minnesota Department of Corrections Commissioner, gave a really no-nonsense testimony directly refuting the numerous unsubstantiated claims of Minnesota corrections facilities not cooperating with immigration enforcement. They have been, they always have been, they've even stood up a website to prove it. So also significantly, Keith Ellison has showed a remarkable amount of savvy recently navigating the modern media landscape, which is another thing that I really pay attention to, because that's a skill set we absolutely need to see in our representatives, elected or otherwise. One of the standout interviews that he gave that I was really paying attention to was a 30-minute interview with Hassan Piker from January 23rd. So Hassan, for those of you not familiar with him, is a leftist new media influencer most known for regular Twitch streaming, and I think he's just really political commentary driven for the most part. A quick view shows that he has a Twitch following of about 3 million subscribers, and I know of him just because some of my leftist friends have brought him up as a relevant pundit, aligned more with their views than, say, anybody in old media. So in the hearing yesterday, I think Keith performed admirably. Now, a couple of the Republican Senate members, specifically Ron Johnson and Josh Hawley, were just over the top performative clowns with no substance and emotional tabloid style attacks on specifically Keith Ellison's character. I have thought for many years that Republicans are either stupid or evil, and both is included. But I now think that there, at least a few, are actually lizard people with no human conscience or morality. In fact, I was kind of waiting for them to start scratching at their face and accidentally peeled the skin off, because that's how inhuman these people were acting. But luckily, Keith was not putting up with any of that performative shit, and when these two Republican Senate members tried to use their tabloid-style bullshit, he gave them this iconic smirk. I think so. What was more telling to me was his response to Joni Ernst, who is a Republican senator from Iowa on the panel. Her line of questioning aligned itself directly with that bunk-ass narrative that the occupation of Minnesota was justified due to fraud, as popularized by a viral video from a lesser-known YouTuber alleging rampant daycare fraud that has been consistently pointed to by right-wingers as a justification to occupy a city with paramilitary goons and abducted citizens. Now, Joni, like her colleagues, does work herself into shouting during her questioning, right? Without any provocation or response, she just kind of escalates the volume. But Keith's response is so telling to me. Because with Hawley and Johnson, who really showed no legitimate concern other than political grandstanding, Keith didn't play ball. But to Ernst's question, and I think that she does truly represent an incredibly important segment of the largely rural Midwest constituents, he responds admirably and honestly. And I'm going to quote him here. Senator, thank you. I really do believe that you're sincerely, earnestly trying to look out for taxpayer dollars. And I'm here to tell you that, of course, we're here to hold people accountable who committed fraud. I've prosecuted over 300 people since I became Attorney General for fraud. So that interaction really stood out to me, because even after being subjected to the insane ramblings and accusations of the two lizard people in the room, again, Ron Johnson from Wisconsin and Josh Hawley from Missouri, he was still genuinely listening and trying to answer in good faith the questions, even when brought up by the notably hostile Republican side of the room. I do think that this focus on fraud and government spending ought to be front and center for any American voter. Fraud has been a major manufactured focus tied to the occupation here in Minnesota based on alleged Somali daycare fraud from a YouTube video that was made viral in ways that I'm still suspicious of. I just don't think organically the quality of the journalism in that video would have gotten it 20 plus million views, but here we are. Joni Ernst claims that 10% of federal spending is linked to fraud. That's part of her testimony that she leads up into the attempted questioning of Keith Ellison. And I personally have a bit of a tricky time following that leap from that claim that 10% of federal spending is fraud to a focus specifically on Minnesota State Health and Human Services spending that might be going to daycares. So let's take a look from a high level at some of the federal budgets and Minnesota's Health and Human Services budget for fiscal year 26. And let's keep in mind and think about whether it makes sense financially to focus on Minnesota state fraud here, or maybe auditing federal spending might be a more worthwhile way of protecting one's constituents' tax dollars. So in Minnesota, the budget for state agencies is proposed each biennial by the governor's office. So there's one budget for each 2 years. And then it's reviewed by the Minnesota legislature and potentially modified by legislative budget proposals before it gets approved. Looking at the office from the governor's report from January 16th, 2025, we're looking at a proposed HHS in Minnesota annual budget of $877 million, of which 349 million came from the federal government. Department of Defense spending for fiscal year 26 is an estimated $1.42 trillion. That is 4,068 times as much as the estimated Minnesota federal expenditure for health and human services. The Department of Homeland Security spending for fiscal year 26 is budgeted at a total of $63.6 billion, so an order of magnitude down. And about half of that goes to ICE and Customs and Border Protection. That $63.6 billion budget is 182 times the total Minnesota federal health and human services budget expenditure. The Federal Department of Health and Human Services has a fiscal year 26 budget of $135 billion, down significantly from last year due to slashing funding for the National Institutes of Health and the Administration for Children, Families, and Communities. So are we worried about that $135 billion of budget that is for an agency led by RFK Jr., who was yesterday quoted as saying, "I'm not scared of a germ. I used to snort cocaine off of toilet seats," meeting with a conservative podcaster? If 10% of federal government spending is fraud, as somebody who has seen the sausage factory of federal contracting world from the inside, start there to combat fraud. Like, I'm really glad that we're seeing some solidarity on freezing any more DHS funding bills in light of the situation here and in light of that congressional and Senate testimony. But this kind of accepted excuse that we are looking at fraud in Minnesota as a major problem while ignoring the ways that our federal government is spending their massive, massive budget is just so disingenuous. I personally think that all defense spending should be frozen until the DoD can pass a financial audit. They are the single biggest recipient of federal funding, and the DoD has never passed a financial audit. And the work I was personally doing to lead a project for the DoD to get their IT system set up in a way that would allow for that to be possible was terribly mismanaged and canceled for political reasons. Why aren't the Republican fiscal hawks who care so much about responsible government spending focusing their attentions there?